They were already celebrating when I walked in. The sharp pop of a champagne cork echoed across the glass walls of the lakeside sales office, followed by polite laughter and the low hum of dealmakers congratulating themselves on a perfect closing day. I could smell it before I even reached the door. The mix of fresh-cut pine from those brand-new cabins, lake water drifting in on the breeze, and that faint chemical tang of printed contracts still warm from the copier. 14 lakefront cabins. Every single one sold. Every single one about to change hands. And every single one built on land they thought they owned. I paused just long enough to watch through the glass. Suits shaking hands. Buyers smiling like they'd just secured a piece of paradise. Margaret Holloway stood at the center of it all, her white blazer catching the sunlight like she was the one who owned the lake itself. HOA president. Local celebrity. The kind of woman who spoke softly but moved paperwork like a bulldozer. She laughed at something the closing attorney said, lifting her glass slightly, already tasting victory. What she didn't know? I'd been watching this entire thing from the moment the first survey stake hit the dirt. I pushed the door open. The room shifted just slightly, the way conversations always dip when someone unexpected walks in. Boots on polished tile. The sound carried. Measured. Calm. I didn't rush. I never do. My name is Ethan Cole. 38. Civil engineer by trade. Water rights consultant when the stakes are high. And that lake outside, that wasn't just scenery to me. That shoreline had been in my family since 1948, long before any HOA board ever learned how to spell the word easement. My father used to tell me, standing knee-deep in that water, land isn't what people fight over, son. It's what they think they can control. I learned early. Ownership isn't always about fences or deeds you can see. Sometimes it's about the one line buried in paperwork that nobody bothers to read until it's too late. I nodded politely as I stepped further inside, catching Maggie's eye for just a fraction of a second. Her smile didn't falter, but I saw the flicker. Recognition without concern. To her, I was already irrelevant. That was the part I'd been counting on. Because while they were pouring foundations, installing docks, and advertising private lake access in glossy brochures, I was digging through records that hadn't been touched in over 70 years. While they were selling dreams, I was tracing boundaries that didn't show up on any modern map. I took a seat near the end of the table, close enough to hear the scratch of pens against paper as the first buyer leaned forward to sign. The lake shimmered through the windows behind them, calm, inviting, perfect, completely untouchable. Not yet. Not legally. Not without me. And that was the part nobody in that room understood. They thought today was the finish line. For me, it was the moment everything actually started. I grew up measuring time by the way the light hit that shoreline, not by clocks or calendars. Early mornings meant a thin layer of mist hovering just above the water, the kind that made everything feel quieter than it really was, like the world was holding its breath. By noon, the Texas sun would burn it off, turning the surface into a sheet of glass, so bright it hurt your eyes if you stared too long. That was where my father taught me everything that mattered. Not with lectures, not with rules, but with repetition. The steady crunch of gravel under our boots as we walked the property line. The smell of damp earth after a storm. The way he would stop at the same spot every single time, look out over the water, and say nothing for a few seconds like he was listening to something I could not hear yet. I inherited 52 acres when he passed, but the truth is, the land never really felt like something I owned. It felt like something I was responsible for. There is a difference. People think land ownership is about square footage and property values. They look at maps and see boundaries drawn in clean, straight lines. What they do not see are the layers underneath, the agreements buried in county records, the rights that do not show up on a satellite image. My father understood that. He made sure I did too. When I was 12, he handed me a folded document so old the edges felt like they might crumble in my hands. 1948. That was the year my grandfather secured shoreline control, when this entire area was nothing but ranch land and dirt roads. No subdivisions. No homeowners associations. No marketing brochures promising luxury lake living. Just a handshake, a survey, and a line written in ink that still held more power than any modern contract I had seen. Read it, he told me. I remember the smell of the paper, dry and faintly sweet, like something stored away too long. I did not understand all of it back then, but I understood the way he watched me while I read. Careful. patient, like he was waiting for me to realize something on my own. Years later, after engineering school, after working water infrastructure projects across 3 states, after consulting on disputes where millions of dollars hinged on a single clause, I finally understood exactly what he had given me. Not just land. Leverage. The kind that does not make noise. The kind that waits. That is why, when I came back and saw those 14 cabins rising along the edge of the lake, I did not panic. I did not argue with the construction crews or chase down permits at the county office. I stood there, boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt, listening to the hum of nail guns and the distant buzz of generators, and I let it happen. Because I knew something they did not. Every beam they lifted, every dock they installed, every advertisement they printed promising private access to that water was built on an assumption. And assumptions, when they are wrong, do not fail quietly. They collapse all at once. I turned away from the shoreline that day with the same calm I had seen in my father years ago, that same quiet pause before action, already knowing exactly where this was going to end. Maggie Holloway did not walk into a room. She arrived like something already decided. You could hear it in the rhythm of her heels before you ever saw her, sharp and measured against polished concrete, the kind of sound that made people straighten their posture without realizing why. The first time I met her was not at that closing table, not with champagne and contracts, but weeks earlier, standing at the edge of the construction site while a crew was setting the final dock supports into place. The air smelled like treated lumber and lake water, that mix of clean and chemical that tells you something permanent is about to happen whether you agree with it or not. She stepped out of a white Lexus SUV, sunglasses still on even though the sun had already dipped behind the tree line, and for a second everything else on that site seemed to slow down around her. Workers kept moving, but quieter. Conversations dropped half a tone. Authority without a uniform. That is how she operated. "You must be Ethan," she said, like she had already practiced the line. Her voice was smooth, controlled, carrying just enough warmth to sound polite, and just enough edge to remind you it was not optional. I nodded, wiping dust from my hands onto my jeans. Up close, she looked exactly like the kind of person who believed rules were tools, not limits. Perfectly set hair that did not move in the breeze. Nails that had never touched real work. A faint perfume that tried to mask something sharper underneath, something closer to calculation than kindness. "We sent notices," she continued, gesturing casually toward the cabins stretching along the shoreline behind her. 14 identical structures spaced with mathematical precision, each one angled to capture the same perfect view of the water. The community voted unanimously. Development rights were clearly transferred through updated surveys. There it was. The word surveys. Clean. Official. Dangerous when people assume they replace history. I followed her gaze toward the cabins, listening to the distant hum of a generator kicking on and the hollow echo of a nail gun snapping into wood. Everything about the project was designed to look inevitable, like it had always been meant to be there. "Beautiful work," I said, and I meant it. That was the part that threw her. People expect resistance. Anger. Some kind of immediate pushback they can manage, redirect, or shut down. Calm confuses them. She studied me for a second longer than necessary, like she was trying to decide whether I understood what was happening or if I was just another landowner too slow to react. Behind her, one of the contractors called out measurements, something about spacing the docks exactly 8 feet apart to meet code. Code. Another word people trust too easily. "We are bringing value to this area," she said, turning back toward me, the faintest smile returning to her lips. "Lakefront living. Structured. Managed. Protected. Protected." I almost smiled at that. Not because she was wrong about what she was building, but because she had no idea what she was missing. I nodded again, slow, deliberate, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel natural. "Looks like you have everything under control," I said. And that was the moment she made her first real mistake. She believed me. She gave a small, satisfied nod, like a deal had already been finalized in her head, then turned back toward her car, already moving on to the next decision, the next signature, the next expansion. She never asked what I knew. She never asked what I had seen. She assumed that if there was a problem, it would have been loud, immediate, obvious. She did not understand the kind of leverage that waits. As her car door closed and the engine started, I stood there a few seconds longer, watching the reflection of those cabins ripple across the surface of the lake, perfect lines breaking slightly with every movement of the water. 14 structures, 14 investments, 14 promises built on one missing detail. And the only thing louder than construction is silence when it finally matters. The first sign that something was off did not come from a lawsuit or a warning letter. It came from a brochure. Glossy paper, thick enough to feel expensive, edges sharp like it had just come off a commercial press. I found one sitting on the hood of my truck one morning, tucked neatly under the windshield wiper like it belonged there. The photo on the front showed those cabins glowing in sunset light, reflections stretched perfectly across the lake like a mirror that had never been disturbed. At the top, in clean serif font, it read Private Lakefront Living. I stood there for a moment, the early air still cool, the faint smell of dew lifting off the grass as the sun came up behind me, and I read every word. Exclusive access. Direct shoreline entry. Premium waterfront experience. Each phrase carefully chosen, each one leaning on the same assumption. Access. That was the word they were selling. Not the wood. Not the square footage. Not even the view. Access to the water. I could hear the construction site already coming alive in the distance. Engines turning over, the low rumble of a generator kicking in, followed by the rhythmic snap of nail guns echoing across the lake. Progress. Momentum. Confidence. I folded the brochure once slow and precise and set it on the passenger seat. Later that day, I drove into town and stopped by the county records office, the same building that had not changed in decades. Fluorescent lights humming overhead. The faint smell of paper, dust, and something metallic from the filing cabinets that lined the walls. Mrs. Carter was behind the counter, same as always, glasses low on her nose, flipping through documents with the kind of familiarity that only comes from doing the same job for 30 years. She looked up when I walked in, gave a small nod. No questions. She knew me. Everyone who has land around here eventually passes through that room enough times to become part of the background. Looking for something old or something new? She asked, already turning toward the records before I answered. Old, I said. She smiled slightly at that. Old meant complicated. Old meant forgotten. Old meant powerful if you knew what you were doing. The drawer slid open with a soft metal scrape, folders shifting as she moved through decades of transactions, surveys, agreements that most people would never think to revisit. I waited, listening to the quiet rhythm of paper moving, the occasional click of a file being set aside, until she placed a stack on the counter in front of me. I did not rush. That is the part most people get wrong. They think discovery is a moment. It is not. It is a process. Page by page. Line by line. Language that feels outdated until you realize it is still enforceable. And then I saw it again. The same clause my father had handed me years ago, buried in a document dated 1948, written in a style nobody uses anymore, but still recognized by every court that matters. Shoreline control. Exclusive access rights. Non-transferable without express written consent. I ran my fingers lightly over the paper, feeling the slight indentation where the original pen had pressed into it decades ago. That was the moment the entire structure they were building shifted in my mind. Not physically, not yet, but legally, completely. I thanked Mrs. Carter, gathered the documents, and stepped back outside into the heat of the afternoon, the sound of distant construction carrying all the way into town like an echo of something that had already gone too far to stop. Too far for them. Exactly far enough for me. Because by then, it was no longer a question of whether they were wrong. It was a question of when it would matter the most. And that answer was not today. I did what anyone would expect me to do first. I went through the front door. The next morning, I drove back out to the site just after 9, when the sun was already high enough to pull the sharp smell of fresh lumber and sealant into the air. The cabins were nearly finished now, siding sealed, windows reflecting the lake like polished glass, each structure standing in perfect alignment, as if precision alone could make them legitimate. I parked near the temporary sales trailer, gravel crunching under my tires, and stepped out with the folder in my hand. Inside, the air conditioning hummed quietly, pushing against the heat outside, and the smell shifted from construction to something cleaner, coffee and printer ink and stage professionalism. A young assistant looked up from behind a desk, polite but distracted, the kind of person hired to keep things moving, not to question them. I am here to speak with Margaret Holloway. I said, calm, steady, nothing in my tone suggesting urgency. She made a quick call, and a minute later Maggie stepped out from the back office, already smiling like she knew exactly how this conversation was going to go. Ethan, she said, as if we were continuing a pleasant discussion from the day before. Back again. I placed the folder on the table between us, not opening it yet. I wanted to make sure you had seen this, I said. She glanced down briefly, then back at me, her expression unchanged. Confidence. That was the word. Our legal team has reviewed all relevant documentation. She replied smoothly. We are fully compliant with current county surveys and zoning approvals. Current. That word again. I opened the folder and slid the document halfway toward her, just enough for the date to be visible. 1948. The paper itself looked older than everything in that room combined, edges slightly worn, ink faded but still clear. She did not touch it. Not immediately. Instead, she leaned back slightly, arms folding, her smile tightening just a fraction. Ethan, she said, softer now, like she was explaining something simple to someone who did not quite understand. Property development evolves. Historical documents do not always reflect modern land use realities. There it was. Dismissal, wrapped in professionalism. I nodded once, like I had expected that exact response. That is true, I said. Unless those documents were never legally dissolved. That was the moment her eyes flicked down, just briefly, scanning the visible portion of the page. Not reading. Not yet. Just checking. Calculating. The silence stretched for a second, then two, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning unit and the distant sound of a truck backing up outside, that slow, repetitive beeping echoing through the walls. She exhaled lightly, the smile returning, polished back into place. If there were any issues, she said, sliding the folder back toward me without opening it, our attorneys would have flagged them. You are welcome to submit your concerns through the appropriate channels. Appropriate channels. Translation, delay, redirect, minimize. I closed the folder, slow and deliberate, and picked it up without another word. There was no point in pushing further. Not now. Not here. Because this was the part most people get wrong. They think the first confrontation is where you win. It is not. It is where you measure. I stepped back outside into the heat, the brightness hitting hard after the controlled lighting inside, and listened for a moment to the rhythm of construction continuing without interruption. Nothing had changed. Not for them. Not yet. Behind me, through the glass, Maggie was already turning away, already moving on, already confident that whatever I had brought into that room had been handled. And in a way, she was right. That conversation had achieved exactly what it needed to. It confirmed something more important than any document. She was not going to stop, which meant I did not have to either. The difference was, I was not in a hurry. After that conversation, the noise of the project did not slow down, it accelerated. Within 2 weeks, the site transformed from construction zone into something polished, something marketable. The raw smell of cut lumber faded, replaced by the cleaner scent of fresh paint and sealed wood, the kind that signals completion instead of progress. Gravel paths were leveled and compacted, decorative stone laid along the walkways, and those docks, perfectly spaced, extended out over the water like they had always belonged there. But what stood out the most was not the work itself, it was the people. Black SUVs started showing up mid-morning, tires crunching slowly as they pulled up near the cabins. Well-dressed couples stepping out, sunglasses, quiet conversations, the soft click of car doors closing behind them. I watched from a distance more than once, standing just far enough up the hill that the breeze carried sound but not attention. The low murmur of sales pitches drifted upward, words like exclusive, limited availability, direct access, repeated with the kind of confidence that only comes from believing the ground beneath you is solid. Maggie moved through those tours like she owned more than just the development. Clipboard in hand now, not because she needed it, but because it completed the image. Organized. In control. Untouchable. I saw her gesture toward the lake more than once, arm extending outward in a smooth arc, presenting it like a feature included in the purchase. That was the part that never changed. The lake was always the centerpiece. Without it, those cabins were just structures. With it, they became something people were willing to pay for. I kept track of the signs they put up near the entrance, the ones that changed every few days as units moved. Available turned into under contract, then into pending. Small shifts in wording that meant large shifts in money. I did not need access to their books to understand what was happening. Each change represented another buyer, another agreement built on the same assumption. I could feel the timing tightening, like a line being pulled slowly but steadily toward a fixed point. One afternoon, I walked the edge of my property where it met the shoreline, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth near the waterline. The lake was calm, just a light ripple breaking the reflection of those cabins across the surface. From that angle, you could see exactly what the buyers saw. Open water, clean lines, no visible boundaries. It looked like freedom. That is what they were selling. I crouched down near the edge, letting my fingers hover just above the water without touching it, feeling the cool air rising off the surface. Access. Such a simple word. Such an expensive one when it is missing. Behind me, I heard the distant sound of another vehicle arriving, tires crunching, doors opening, another tour beginning. The rhythm was consistent now. Interest, offers, contracts, momentum building in. A straight line toward a single day, closing day. That was when everything would be finalized. Funds transferred, ownership confirmed, liability locked in. That was when assumptions stopped being theoretical and started carrying consequences. I stood up slowly, brushing dirt from my hands, and took one last look at the cabins before turning away. They had built exactly what they intended to build. They had marketed it perfectly. They had sold it successfully. And they had done all of it without ever asking the one question that mattered. Not who owned the land, not who approved the permits, but who controlled the water they were promising to everyone who signed those contracts. And by the time they realized the answer, it would already be too late to adjust anything at all. The first crack did not come from a courtroom or a complaint. It came from a conversation that was never meant for me to hear. It was late afternoon, the kind of heat that settles low and heavy, pressing everything down into a slower rhythm. I was parked up along the ridge again, engine off, windows down, letting the breeze carry whatever it wanted to bring. Below me, near cabin 7, a couple stood with one of the sales agents, their voices rising just enough to separate from the background noise. So the dock is included, right? The man asked, his tone casual but precise, the way people talk when they are about to commit to something expensive. The agent nodded immediately, confident, rehearsed. Absolutely. Full lake access comes with every unit. There it was again. Access. The word repeated so often it had become invisible to them. The woman hesitated, just for a second. And that is guaranteed? Like legally, she added, her voice softer, but sharper. That was the moment the agent shifted. It was subtle, almost nothing, but I heard it. A slight pause. A breath taken half a second too long. Everything has been reviewed through county approvals, he replied, redirecting without answering the actual question. Clean. Professional. Incomplete. The couple exchanged a glance. Not doubt exactly, but not full certainty either. That was how it starts. Not with a problem, but with a question that does not get a real answer. They moved on, conversation smoothing back into surface-level excitement. But that moment stayed with me, because it confirmed something I had already suspected. The weakness in their entire operation was not hidden in some obscure legal code that only a specialist could understand. It was sitting right there in plain language, in every promise they were making. All it needed was one person to ask the right question at the wrong time. I stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching under my boots, and walked a few yards closer to the edge of my property. From here, the cabins looked complete. Finished. Market ready. The lake stretched out behind them, wide and open, reflecting the sky in long, uninterrupted lines. No fences. No barriers. Nothing visible to suggest limitation. That was the illusion they were selling. And illusions hold as long as nobody challenges them. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, scrolling through the photos I had taken over the past few weeks. Survey markers. Dock placements. Property lines that did not align the way their marketing suggested they did. Each image by itself looked harmless. Together, they told a very different story. A story about boundaries that had been assumed, not verified. I zoomed in on one particular image, the one that showed the exact point where their dock extended just far enough to cross into the controlled shoreline zone. Not by much. A few feet at most. But enough. Always enough. That was the nature of this kind of oversight. It did not need to be dramatic. It just needed to be precise. The sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the water, turning those perfect reflections into something slightly distorted, like the lake itself was starting to reveal what the eye could not catch at first glance. Down below, another group arrived, another tour beginning, the same script repeating, the same promises delivered with the same certainty. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and took a slow breath, the air cooler now, carrying that familiar scent of water and earth. The system they had built was strong on the surface, organized, efficient, profitable. But underneath, there was a single point of failure running through every contract, every sale, every expectation. And now I knew exactly where it was. More importantly, I knew they had no idea it existed. By the time I sat down to go through everything line by line, the sun had already dropped behind the ridge, leaving the lake in that quiet, dim blue that makes every sound feel closer than it is. I spread the documents out across my kitchen table, the old deed from 1948 at the center, surrounded by printouts of current surveys, zoning maps, and the glossy marketing materials they had been handing out like guarantees. The overhead light hummed softly, casting a steady glow over paper that represented two completely different realities. One built on assumption, the other on language that had never been removed, never amended, never replaced. I started with the original easement clause, reading it slowly, not because I did not understand it, but because precision matters when everything depends on interpretation. Exclusive shoreline control. That phrase carried weight. Not shared. Not implied. Exclusive. It defined who had the legal right to access, use, and authorize any interaction with that strip of land where water meets soil. And more importantly, it defined who did not. I pulled one of the newer survey maps closer, the kind printed with clean lines and modern labeling, the kind that gives people confidence because it looks official. Their boundary lines stopped just short of the water in some places, overlapped slightly in others, but nowhere did it show a transfer of shoreline rights. That was the detail they had either missed or chosen to ignore. Either way, the result was the same. I leaned back slightly, letting the chair creak under the shift, and closed my eyes for a second, replaying the layout in my head. 14 cabins, 14 docks, 14 promises of direct lake access, each one tied to a contract that assumed the same thing. That access was included. That access was legal. That access was guaranteed. I reached for my laptop and pulled up the county database, cross-referencing parcel numbers, ownership records, and any filings that might have modified the original easement. Nothing. No amendments. No releases. No recorded agreements that would override what had been established decades ago. The silence of that absence was louder than anything else. Because in this kind of situation, what is not there matters just as much as what is. I printed out a clean copy of the easement, highlighting the sections that removed any ambiguity, then added a second page outlining the implications in plain language. No technical jargon. No room for interpretation. If you did not have authorization from me, you did not have legal access to the shoreline, which meant you did not have legal access to the lake. It was that simple. I stacked the pages neatly, tapping them against the table to align the edges, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Everything about this had to be clean, clear, undeniable, because timing was going to do the rest. I checked the closing schedule I had managed to get a copy of, noting the dates, the order of transactions, the sequence of ownership transfers that would finalize everything. They were days away now, maybe less. That was when the assumption would harden into liability. That was when the difference between what they thought they were selling and what they could actually deliver would stop being theoretical. I gathered the documents into a single folder and set it aside, not hidden, not rushed, just placed where I would not forget it. Outside, the lake was completely still, the surface smooth enough to reflect the sky without distortion. It looked perfect, complete, exactly the image they had built their entire project around. And I sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet, understanding something that had been true from the beginning. They had done everything right, except for one thing. They never verified the one piece that made all the others matter. I did not go into this alone, not because I needed help understanding the law, but because I needed confirmation from someone who had nothing to gain from agreeing with me. The next morning, I drove into town again, earlier this time, before the traffic built up, before the courthouse steps filled with people trying to fix problems that had already gone too far. The air was cooler, carrying that faint smell of morning coffee drifting from the diner across the street as I parked and stepped out with the folder under my arm. The office I walked into was smaller than most people would expect, tucked between a title company and an insurance agency, the kind of place you would pass without noticing unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. A simple brass plate by the door read Daniel Reeves, Land and Water Rights Attorney. Inside, the space was quiet, lined with shelves of binders and case files that looked like they had been used, not displayed. Daniel was already there, sleeves rolled up, reading glasses low on. His nose as he looked up when I entered. He did not smile right away. He just nodded once, like he had already guessed why I was there. "Ethan," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. "What did they build this time?" I set the folder down between us and opened it without saying anything, sliding the easement copy and the survey overlays into view. He leaned forward slightly, the chair creaking under the shift, and began reading in silence. Minutes passed, the kind of silence that matters. No interruptions, no assumptions, just careful attention to detail. I watched his expression, not for reaction, but for change. The moment something clicks. It came slowly, almost imperceptible, a slight tightening around his eyes, a subtle shift in posture as he went back to reread a section. Then he leaned back, exhaled once, and removed his glasses. "They did not clear this," he said, more to himself than to me. I did not respond. I did not need to. He tapped the document lightly with one finger, right on the clause that defined everything. "This is still active, fully enforceable. No modifications, no releases. Nothing in the county record overrides it." He looked up at me then, and this time there was something different in his expression. Not concern, not confusion, recognition. "They sold access they do not legally have," he continued, his voice steady now, grounded in certainty. "Every contract that includes lake access is built on a false assumption." I let that settle in the room for a second, the weight of it filling the space between us. Outside, a car passed by, tires rolling over pavement, the faint sound filtering through the window. Normal life continuing, unaware of the scale of what had just been confirmed. "Timing matters," I said finally. He nodded immediately. "If you had brought this in before construction, it would have been a zoning dispute. Annoying, but manageable. Now," he paused, letting the implication speak for itself. "Now it is exposure. Financial, legal, reputational." He slid the papers back toward me, aligning them carefully, like they deserved precision. "When are they closing?" I gave him the date. He let out a quiet breath through his nose, almost a laugh, but without humor. "That is not just bad timing," he said. "That is catastrophic timing." I closed the folder slowly, feeling the edges of the paper pressed together under my hands. This was the confirmation I needed. Not that I was right. I already knew that. But that it would land the way I expected it to. Clean. Undeniable. Irreversible once it happened. I stood up, tucking the folder back under my arm, and Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching me for a second longer than necessary. "You are not going to warn them, are you?" he asked. I shook my head once. No hesitation. No second thought. "No," I said. And that was the moment everything shifted from preparation to execution. Planning something like this is not about speed, it is about alignment. Every piece has to land at the same time, or it does not land at all. I spent the next 2 days doing nothing visible, which is exactly how it should be. No calls, no emails, no confrontation, just preparation, the kind that leaves no gaps. I started by organizing the documents into 3 separate sets, each one tailored for a different purpose. The first was the original easement, clean and untouched, the foundation. The second was a simplified explanation, written in plain language that anyone in that room could understand without needing a legal background. No room for confusion. No room for interpretation. The third was the overlay, the one that showed exactly where their docks crossed into controlled shoreline, the visual that would remove any remaining doubt. I placed each set into its own folder, labeled but not marked in any way that would draw attention. Clean, neutral, professional. Timing was everything, but delivery mattered just as much. I reviewed the closing schedule again, noting the order of signatures, the sequence of transactions, the exact moment when funds would be committed but not yet irreversible. That window was small, measured in minutes, not hours. That was where this had to happen. Too early, and they would delay. Too late, and the damage would already be done. I needed it to hit at the precise point where assumption turned into obligation. The morning before closing, I drove out to the lake one last time, not to check anything, but to confirm the feeling. The air was still, the surface of the water smooth, reflecting the cabins in perfect symmetry. From a distance, it looked complete. Finished. Like nothing could disrupt it. I walked down to the shoreline, boots pressing into the damp earth, and stood at the exact boundary line I had memorized years ago. Invisible to anyone who did not know it was there. Absolute to anyone who did. I let my eyes follow the line across the water, tracing it mentally through each dock, each structure, each promise that had been made without verification. 14 points of exposure. 14 contracts built on the same missing piece. I took a slow breath, the air cool against my lungs, carrying that familiar scent of water and soil, grounding everything in something real. There was no anger in it. No urgency. Just clarity. Back at home, I set out what I would wear the next day. Nothing dramatic. Dark jeans. A clean button-down. Boots. The same way I always showed up. Because this was not about appearance. It was about presence. Calm. Controlled. Certain. I placed the primary folder by the door, where I would not forget it, and left it there overnight, untouched. Sleep came easily. That is another thing people misunderstand. They think moments like this keep you awake. They do not. Not when you know exactly what is going to happen. The next morning, the sky was clear, the kind of blue that makes everything feel sharper, more defined. I drove out to the sales office with the same steady pace I always used, gravel crunching under the tires as I pulled in. The lot was already filling up. Buyers, agents, attorneys, all of them moving with purpose, all of them believing they were about to finalize something solid. I stepped out, picked up the folder, and paused for just a second before walking toward the door. Inside, they were already gathering around the table, documents stacked, pens ready, the quiet hum of anticipation filling the room. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. And so was I. The first pen touched paper at exactly 10:17 in the morning. I remember the time because I was watching the clock on the wall, not out of nerves, but because timing was the only variable left. The room carried that familiar mix of quiet anticipation and controlled confidence. The soft shuffle of documents being aligned, the faint scratch of chairs adjusting as people leaned forward, ready to finalize what they believed was a completed transaction. Maggie stood near the head of the table, one hand resting lightly against the polished surface, her posture relaxed, composed, already transitioning mentally to whatever came after this deal closed. The buyers sat across from her, reviewing the final pages, their expressions focused but satisfied, the kind of calm that comes from thinking everything has already been handled. The closing attorney cleared his throat softly, signaling the next step, his voice steady as he outlined the final confirmations. Funds verified. Titles prepared. Signatures pending. Everything moving in a straight, predictable line toward completion. I waited. Not because I was unsure, but because this was the exact moment the structure reached its highest point. The moment when every assumption had been fully committed but nothing had been locked beyond reversal. That was when I stepped forward. The sound of my boots against the floor was not loud, but it was enough. Enough to shift attention. Enough to break the rhythm. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Pens hovered just above paper. I reached the table and placed the first folder down, not forcefully, not dramatically, just enough for the sound to register. A clean, deliberate interruption. Maggie looked up immediately, her expression tightening just slightly as recognition settled in. Not concern. Not yet. Just awareness. Ethan, she said, her tone measured, controlled, like she was preparing to manage whatever this was. I did not respond to her name. I opened the folder instead, sliding the top document forward so that the date was visible to everyone at the table. 1948. Old paper against new contracts. Two timelines colliding in the same space. Before anyone signs, I said, my voice steady, carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room without needing to be raised. There is something you need to see. The attorney's attention shifted immediately, his professional instinct overriding the momentum of the moment. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly as he read the header, then the first few lines, his posture changing as the meaning began to settle. One of the buyers glanced at him, then back at me, uncertainty replacing the quiet confidence that had filled the room seconds earlier. I placed the second document beside the first, the simplified explanation, clear and direct, no room for interpretation. This property, I continued, tapping lightly near the relevant section, does not include legal access to the shoreline without authorization. The words hung in the air, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just precise. The kind of statement that does not need volume to carry weight. The room went still, not silent in the absence of sound, but still in the way people become when they are processing something that does not fit into what they expected. Maggie's expression shifted again, faster this time, calculation replacing confidence, her eyes moving from the document to the attorney, then back to me. That is not accurate, she said quickly, but there was a difference now. A fraction of hesitation where there had been none before. I slid the third document forward, the overlay map, the visual that removed any remaining doubt, showing exactly where each dock extended into controlled shoreline. No argument, no interpretation, just alignment of fact. The attorney stood up slightly from his chair, the movement small but decisive, his attention fully engaged now. We need to pause, he said, his voice firm, cutting cleanly through the room. Pens lowered. Papers stopped moving. Momentum broken. And just like that, everything they had built, every agreement, every expectation, every assumption, stopped exactly where it was, suspended between what they believed and what was actually true. The shift in the room was immediate, but the consequences moved slower, like a ripple that takes time to reach the far edge of the water. No one spoke at first. The attorney remained standing, one hand resting on the table, eyes moving between the documents and the faces around him, recalculating everything that had just been assumed. One of the buyers leaned back in his chair, the soft creak of wood and leather breaking the silence, his earlier confidence replaced by something sharper, something closer to concern. What does this mean for access? He asked, his voice controlled but no longer casual. The question landed exactly where it needed to. The attorney did not answer immediately. He flipped through the pages again, slower this time, verifying what he already knew. It means, he said carefully, choosing each word with precision, that the properties as currently described do not include guaranteed legal access to the lake without additional authorization. The words were neutral, professional, but the impact was not. Across the table, another buyer set his pen down completely, sliding the contract a few inches away from him as if distance might clarify the situation. Maggie stepped forward then, her composure tightening into something more rigid, more deliberate. This is being misrepresented, she said, her voice firm, attempting to reassert control over a room that was no longer moving in her direction. We have county-approved surveys and development rights. The attorney glanced at her, then back at the document, and for the first time, he did not align with her momentum. Surveys do not override recorded easements, he replied, his tone still calm, but now anchored in something final. That was the moment the dynamic broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just definitively. One of the buyers picked up the overlay map, studying the lines, the placement of the docks, the boundary that had never been addressed. So you are telling me, he said slowly, looking up, that I could own this cabin and still not be allowed to use the water directly? No one answered immediately. They did not need to. The silence carried the truth more clearly than any explanation could. Another chair shifted. Another contract slid back. Small movements, but each one moved the room further away from where it had been 10 minutes earlier. Maggie's expression changed again, faster now, calculation giving way to urgency as she turned toward the attorney. We can resolve this, she said, her tone tightening, searching for ground that was no longer stable. We can address any discrepancies post-closing. The attorney shook his head once, not aggressively, just enough to remove that option from the table. Not under these conditions, he said. This would need to be fully disclosed and resolved before any transaction proceeds. The word resolved hung in the air like something heavy. Because resolution meant delay. Delay meant exposure. And exposure meant every contract in that room was now a liability instead of an asset. One by one, the buyers began gathering their documents, not in panic, not in anger, but with the quiet decisiveness of people who understood risk when they saw it. The room that had started the morning filled with anticipation now felt different, the energy drained of certainty, replaced by careful distance. I did not say anything else. I did not need to. Everything that needed to be understood had already been placed on the table. The folders remained where I had set them, open, visible, undeniable. And as I stepped back from the table, giving the space back to them, I could feel the shift complete. Not in volume, not in emotion, but in reality. What had been a finished deal was now an unresolved problem. And there is a difference between those two things that no amount of confidence can bridge once it has been exposed. By the time I stepped outside, the air felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because certainty had been removed from a place that depended on it. The sound of conversation continued behind me, quieter now, more controlled. The tone shifted from celebration to negotiation without anyone needing to announce it. I walked past the row of parked cars, the sunlight reflecting off windshields in sharp flashes, and headed toward the edge of the property where the view opened up again. The lake stretched out in front of me, calm as ever, its surface untouched by what had just happened inside that room. That was the thing about it. The water did not care about contracts or assumptions. It only responded to what was real. I stopped at the same spot I had stood countless times before, boots settling into the familiar ground, and looked out across the line where land met water. From here, the cabins still looked perfect. Clean lines, balanced spacing, every detail exactly as it had been designed. Nothing about them had changed. And yet everything about them had. Because value is not in what something looks like. It is in what it allows you to do. Without access, those structures were no longer what they had been marketed as. They were something else now. Something incomplete. Behind me, a door opened, then closed again, footsteps approaching over gravel. I did not turn immediately. I already knew who it was. Maggie stopped a few feet away, the silence between us stretching for a second before she spoke. "You could have come to me," she said, her voice lower now, stripped of the polished confidence it had carried before. Not weak, just different, adjusted. I kept my eyes on the water for a moment longer before answering. "I did," I said simply. That was all it needed. The memory of that earlier conversation sat between us, unchanged, undeniable. She exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible over the faint movement of the breeze across the lake. "This does not have to end like this," she added, her tone shifting again, searching for ground that still existed. I finally turned, meeting her gaze without urgency. "It already did," I replied. Not harsh, not emotional, just accurate. Because what had happened inside was not a beginning. It was the result, the outcome of every step that had come before it. She held my gaze for a moment longer, then looked past me toward the water, following the same line I had been tracing for years, seeing it now not as a feature, but as a boundary. The realization was quiet, but it was there. She nodded once, almost to herself, then turned and walked back toward the building, her pace measured, controlled, but no longer certain. I watched her go for a second, then turned back to the lake. The reflection of the cabins stretched across the surface, clear and undisturbed, a perfect image of something that no longer matched reality. I crouched slightly, reaching down until my fingers hovered just above the water again, feeling the cool air rising from it without breaking the surface. Close enough to touch, not close enough to claim. That was the difference. That was always the difference. I stood up slowly, letting the moment settle into something final, something complete, and took one last look across the shoreline before turning away. They had built something impressive. They had sold it with precision. They had believed in it completely. But belief does not create ownership. And in the end, they did not lose because I stopped them. They lost because they never checked the one thing that mattered. They built everything around the view. I owned the only part that made the view real.